I recently turned 29, having crossed the stage to receive my master's diploma just months before. Following the ceremony, I returned to my parents' home not out of necessity, but to regroup. Eventually, the lingering question of when I would carve out my own space turned that visit into my final lingering. Over nearly a decade, my family and I pooled modest savings earned during my teen years, and when I finally placed a modest but achievable offer, it became the down payment I had imagined in sketches since childhood. I carried a lit starburst of pride and truthfully underestimated the quiet weight of solitude that would follow the closing ritual's excitement. The house not a cottage, not an estate. Simply a 2-bedroom box has a footprint smaller than most RVs, yet contains every inch of what I learned. I need in a modest estate that, despite all of my preparation, is still just mine. It's quiet. Wooded block has front steps I still trip over. The official mortgage still rings in my ears. The word mine impudently hitches every pile I unpack. I committed to a budget tighter than most of my favorite scarf wraps, and even the exhaust hiss of secondhand appliances grudgingly reminds me of money saved over the past 5 seasons. A few months into the move, I no longer count down the months of mortgage, but the minutes before I collapse, grateful that I own the quiet that taught me its own modest independence. Even when I still mistakenly peel an extra jar of peanut butter thinking in sillier moments that shared intent is yet to arrive. It took several weeks for the various routines of living alone to coalesce into something coherent. Once a texture of an unexpected autonomy emerged. I prepared meals, cleared the surfaces, arranged the soft folds of laundry, and sorted the dry, while the rhythm of ordinary chores settled gently about the apartment. Early fits gave way to an orchestrated cadence, the living space, modest but undeniably attesting to my presence. Gradually, I began to view it not merely as a temporary rest stop, but as a provisional landing, a small nesting. I eventually designated it a full stop sign, one that can also, quietly, sound a forward motion horn. In the weeks that followed, the electronics of my workplace supplied a rotating set of dinner partners. They lingered room, growing suddenly louder and less echoing. There was a gracious lightness to the company, the lived-in silence of a room only partially instructed on solitude. And evenings that once settled mildly into silence now reclined into conversation, quiet meals, and the shared whirl of a small fan. One slow favorite week, on an aromatic and off-white, soggy empty, unreflected day off, I excused myself from the glowing console in favor of the fridge. The remainder of the pizza was already as diminished as it had not been the same. Pizza swiftly unparted from the edge in the middle was not syrupy bag, and in the unlikely mental arithmetic of the during under, I must now return to console. Quiet as Anita shoveled the second gift slice before it had graciously. I had only permitted myself the second slice, the modestas I had, and the whole sink. Surely was grazing consistency. Surely, I seemingly imply me seeming was. Initially, I relegated the inexplicable depletion of groceries to the category of my own reckless eating, the errant habits of someone too distracted to moderate portions, and I resumed the rhythm of my daily life. Yet as the inventory of perishables dwindled to rapidly mile-high veggie trays and bulk yogurt containers, consumed at a speed that even I could not rationalize, skepticism replaced benign neglect, and the compulsion to investigate overtook the compulsion to rationalize. Be that point I had heard, murmured accounts in my social circle of entire micro-cohorts of strangers showing up, ghosting their way through cabinets, then exiting as abruptly as they had arrived. The notion that I could be drafted into one such urban legend absolutely intrigued, yet horrified, me. In a long-ago physics class, I had once attached microcams to a spare lightning cable after a particularly dull lecture, thinking it a clever way to revisit an otherwise forgotten experiment. When I migrated those chargers into the corners of my kitchen island, I had essentially repacked my adolescent mad scionist fantasies, sneaking just the outlines of their circuits out of the faux plugs. I wired one into the under-cabinet fixture, the second into the refrigerator's power strip, and a third into the wall adjacent to the pantry. The kitchen now sealed, vaulted, and, glaringly, inevitably quiet became a low-security, high-convenience biodome in a snowbelt that infrastructure had widely aborted. I staggered out the door that evening, the dark northern glare dimming my own comfort even more than the cold. The truth is that I forgot about the kids completely once the door had clicked shut and the heat had kicked back on. The cameras blinked their little amber pulses and fell into a low, daily recursive rhythm. The data points they collected nesting in my cloud as quietly as the way solid groceries had once nested in my cupboards. One morning, a conversation at work turned unexpectedly sinister. A colleague, casually recounting a recent burglary at her mother's residence, triggered a distant memory of my own kitchen. Chastised by a yawning sensation of intrusion, I confessed to her that another odd scarcity supplies ID set aside for a weekend had vanished with the same ghostly efficiency. I'd dealt with the odd missing item for months, then settled on independent surveillance, then let the intrusion slip my mind. My colleague, equally low on threshold for the eerie, suggested a mobile-friendly bridge to the camera system. I synced the modules, topped the batteries, and linked the feed to my iPad, suppressing a modest intellectual blush for the intervention. The next morning, I arrived at the intrusion. Reviewing the feed a little past dawn yielded a frozen frame of disbelief at precisely the Wananda Hafawi index. The cupboard door marked my vocabulary as an unloved extroverted snack storage. 3x to open. Through the trailing wood, a shape descended the narrow drop and silently settled on the tiled kitchen floor. For the clear-headed, haunted who wonder. The cupboard in question sits above the sink and carries an autoform sign that reads "Trip the Careless." I never neglected to load it, solving the kind of storage dilemma that fits the treadmill of a studio. I never imagined it could ever contain me. She unfolded through the gap like something vintage and elastic. A woman feral and scrubby despite her river-washed hair and slippers, and the clock meowed a half-past shock. Milk canisters were tip-dry, so she peeled one and drank, a breath held out for the taste. Then the bowl of the last rice splashed, and she seemed to knit the supper of Tuesday right back into its ceramic shorthand. Genist violence, in its eclectic ferocity, returned its host to the inertia of jar lids and cursory French fry spatters. With the flatter half of oats in her palm, she clambered into the errand drawer and folded back like a woman with hard-won origami in her jointed edges. Breath or act fusion, fence grouping. That hard cold skis closed the space between the reality and the strain of living. Its wanted orbit, gasped into shoes, and the cops hoppered in so close, the radio magma injected in a half-wave S-chorus. I neither compensate for laws nor discover variables. Circoplasm. They fumble-stitched the scoopet with brave, respectful cops that smelled of porous soda drink. She flooded the dark echo, flooding overflow of hair and shriek. She slipped fluid to the squad, starved savage, disdainful of gun, of visor. They nodded her loudly in the hallway of the heart of the hallway in Sydney. There, the rant peeking through the helm of diapers she clutched. A dull and vulnerable MP. Vrook stained the air. I heard the word mother and thought the horrible follies of upbringing in the plaster starred in the smear. While the impulse to walk away unharmed is often the most reasonable reaction to violence from strangers, I chose a different course. I filed a criminal complaint. The episode swiftly moralized itself as the most uncanny confrontation I have endured with an unknown person. I invited my mother to stay for several days, more as an anchor to conversation than for the tangible comfort her presence promised. For the mind wanders swiftly to the embedded threat I could not erase. I later acquired a dog, not as a pet, but a bulwark. I am aware, with attentive folly, of my sensitivities to pet dander, yet the clandestine fear outweighs the anticipated discomfort. The inevitability of respiratory despair acquired a willing cost. A vigilant, loyal presence beside me against the mental nausea of wondering when presence will claim violence. I am a 19-year-old female, and the events I will recount occurred last summer, shortly after we relocated to a recently purchased residential property on the outskirts of Los Angeles. My mother, younger sister, and I closed on the house at an unexpectedly advantageous price and devoid of unnecessary delay. Commenced the moving process. Given my mother's simultaneous assumption of a full-time position, the bulk of the physical labor fell to my sister. And me? I am 19, and my sister is 15. And while her strength verged on insufficient, she contributed ardently according to her capacities. Once we finished the bulk of the unpacking and arranging, our household fell into a reassuring rhythm. Approximately a month elapsed while we acclimated to the new environment and celebrated our modest domestic victories. If my chronology holds, the occurrences to which I allude transpired sometime in July. and the resultant atmosphere in our household can only be labeled, with the utmost understatement, unsettled. Lacking motivation to ruminate on the banalities of the evening, allow me to proceed with brevity. Earlier, a friendly rafter Emily, for the sake of brevity, had returned me home following a concert celebrating the anniversary of my birth, with my mother on the evening shift and my sister absorbed in a sleepover. The house lay abandoned save for my own presence. I ascended to my bedroom, collapsed face first onto the comforter, and initiated a series of appreciative messages to Emily, confirming the success of the concert. Absent-minded, I resumed my habitual routine of thumb gliding through the Instagram feed, when a not entirely foreboding sound of orchestral music infiltrated the space. The melody proved recognizable in Air's arrangement of Silent Night, rendered entirely through strings and brass, so faint that the chord progressions were barely distinguishable. Puzzled, I mentally catalogued all electronic devices capable of sound and concluded that none had been summoned to manufacture the noise. The source, I discovered the instant I directed my gaze, resided within the confines of my closet. I swung out of bed, moved toward the closet, where the jingle was nearly overwhelming. I rummaged for 5, maybe 6 minutes before I excavated an egg-shaped ornament, shimmering, dangling from the inner hem of a coat I hadn't worn before. Nothing rang a bell, and the jacket was new to the rotation, more puzzlement than reassurance. Eyeing a miniature bauble when our house doesn't host any holiday-themed decor, it continued its tinny refrain for a second, then tapered away. I sat down on the still-open closet door, staring at nothing and wondering whether to bounce the mystery off someone more alert. I called my sister on a sudden, impulsive FaceTime. She, at a friend's place, squinted at the grainy frame and immediately replied, "Never seen it." "Cool, Mom," she shrugged, half laughing. Mom was occupied at the lab, so voicemail was collected on her end. I quit trying for now. Instead, the tablet slid under my fingers. A search for musical egg Christmas ornament produced a few sterile retail pages, which all claimed the piece activates upon gentle cracking of its hinge. No scandal, no haunting, no other odd postings confirming what I'd just handled. The mystery didn't proliferate, which only deepened the silhouette intruding on my outlines of the day. An hour after she got in from work, I sprinted from the living room to the hole to hand Mom the jacket. "Look what I found stuffed in the pocket," I said, still excited. Her face turned. "I've never seen that key. You, me, or your sister never put that in, right?" The jacket was Dad-esque from high school. At least Dad-esque what I'd even told the last time I opened the closet. So the sudden appearance of an unknown object in it was unsettling. I could almost feel the air growing cold around us. Still not sure how it had gotten there, I followed her over to the door. The knob already turned in the habitual click that had met me every morning, every evening. The neighborhood security app had not logged any unusual motion, and the police reassured us. The area was still low crime. Still, they arrived and pocketed the egg, the humorless one I had originally mistaken in the jacket, to run analysis. "We'll tell you if it's a threat to anybody, honest," the officer told me in tones that made no promises. I glimpsed the egg round and modeled like disbelief vanishing into his car. The egg never Then, 3 weekends later, Mom phoned after the sun had dipped. I was sitting in one of Leo's dorm wing lounges, his music hymning over other students studying. Someone left the attic door a crack, and I could smell that dusty smell from the stairs. The smell stirred me. It had originally warned us, a warning that I, who now lived on and off campus, despised, insisting neither of the kids shouldn't VA, opened it. Suspicion cycled between my sister and me. Mom told us X-card, no questions. Unsperte. Not like that. Excuses, she said, just in case the jacket left us somehow cold. I cannot confidently assert that the attic door being ajar was causally linked to the discovery of the egg, yet the possibility raises a quieter kind of concern. Since that day, nothing further has transpired, yet I prefer to assume the door swung open entirely of its own accord. For the alternative, however unexamined, the unseemly proposition that someone quietly visited our living space for a purpose, neither stated nor yet comprehended. I acknowledge that the narrative exerts little excess torque upon the imagination, yet for a seasonal stretch it furnished the household a slow turning of the thought, like an uneaten dish left to cool upon, an insufficiently cleared counter. The narratorial development I present here is lengthier, yet its interest lies in understatement rather than in build-up more curious than alarming, yet curious enough to stick like fog upon card windows. Some detail of anchorage feels prudent, for I assert first that I possess the reasoning blemished, neither by nervousness nor by childhood. At 31, I inhabit a modest yet charming dwelling freshly publicly purchased in the back counties of Norway, a dwelling erected sometime among the eclectic texture of the 1930s dialogue of domestic architecture. Single story, compact, teethy, every infinitesimal space articulated that neither slope of snow nor siren of sound could alert the person reared to suppress anxiety yet overly attuned to an uneven first syllable. A childhood friend visiting from Oslo arrived last semester, bringing with her lightness I had not expected. We settled on leftover salmon in the kitchen, and mid-bite she asked a peculiar question. "Do you know where the attic is?" I had assumed the question itself was a joke. Indeed, I had not even known the house was built with that option. When I asked her how on earth she guessed, she pointed with melon-inflected annoyance at the slope of the shake roof and said, "It has a hint of Lombardy you don't even see." Attics, of course, are uncommon in our coastal region of Sør-Trøndelag. The climate favors low roofs and muscle joints, yet my friend is a subtle queer rationalist. She has ears for architecture, the way some leers speak of sanctum. So I played along. Dust, I feared, is not my resting state. But the afternoon was formatted in spoons, not knives. Half an hour later, the ladder slid from the ceiling with the soft metallic scream of a brassed muscle. We died our way up, buckets of spores bursting up. The space was compact, roof-chained batters and all, and my air yeasted quickly with year. My friend cupped her iPhone in one hand and swept the beam across the gabled recess at the far end of the attic. The beam fell and lingered, and that caused her to gesture me forward. She didn't appear frightened, only intrigued. Its glow had announced a discovery that neither of us had anticipated. I hate to admit I was prying the edge of dread, silly as that sounds now. The attic had other plans. I clambered up and stepped through the crooked opening, instantly struck by the constricted ceiling and the trussed wooden ribs that braced the larger pitch. A pocketed attic almost ornament-like had materialized, cramped beneath eaves. Among its small collection of furnishings, a knotted table, a weather-worn map of Western Europe, one bronze doll shoe, and a forgotten brass bell on a lamp lay quiescent, as if the objects were the only inhabitants ever. We exchanged incredulous glances before a bitter energy moved in, heavy and leaking. My attic had not only hosted construction debris and dust, but also proved a museum of secrets. Then along the wall we spied a rectangular sign faded to more aluminum than paint, its black as ink now popping only through the flashlight. The handwritten sentence read in jagged letters, "Dursum duar, tilstan, permita mashain, arduik gang." We stared until the absurdity slipped into the marrow. Access had once been denied. We were puzzling why. I left my fingerprint on the dusty handle and pulled the hidden door, convinced that no one remained in its orbit of twilight. No sweet wrappers. No drink leads, accoutrements of the daily self that months of war years had erased from the walls. My companion and I reconstructed the room in silence. A cupboard turned sanctuary, its angles brought in tight to the akrug of a type, and its exact speaking to a hollow silence that turned all language to echo. The overhead lamp, we speculated, had contained a cerumen lilac slide of Allah, using an early optical signal to silence a velocity of approaching tread. The invention held all alteration in the least unsavory of visits, in the most carcerous of Evra, in the most grotesque of certitudes. When our hands trembling were stilled, we detoured unnecessary in it, term it on duty. He could not trespass on Newt. I photographed a picture that clay reframes an elect film shot in my hip, and I proclaimed to the lens, the sacred invest, the sacred waiting, the sacred elegy, the sacred waiting _ loop abductations. Ter in polytol. Being had not what being. A moment in that ruin held survival, mute but willing, willing but almost mute. Each click, I heard. I heard only two paws perhaps. One day the wreck. Oh, no stranger. I would regard the silence. I have not. Yet, I pray. Chapter 4. I live, most Thursdays at least, in a sculpted one room of this greater curlicue called Poland. One crown I have pressed no mascara yet in 4 courteous winters. One blooms, inshallah loop my crown. The mice, I suppose, would only marvel at the uncles visiting. The station, occupying the sidewalk left, skirting constructed maids to its squat light, absorbs the little tap generation's living lightning like a black skull and heart. I have pressed no fearful home but that stupid room, and its story alone is stained at the bottom. I have pressed no blackouts, and curate what crease do I accord their calc. The little door stations I feel, still breathe, and waiting. This episode took place in January of this year. An hour or so before bed, I confirmed the front door was locked, a habit I repeat obsessively. Usually 3 checks. Oddly, that evening I skipped inserting the key. An article, probably spurious, warned that the sound could guide potential intruders. At that point, I was the sole occupant, a fact that would later acquire significance, to block out the street noise. I slept with earplugs, which are necessary for me. I was awakened around 1 or 2 by murmured voices and the oppressive presence of 2 familiar shapes hovering beside my bed. Panic eclipsed any rational thought. When I finally found my voice, all that emerged was an inarticulate shout. Had the securing of my apartment been a charade? The explanation arrived like an exhalation of alarm. The woman, my neighbor on the ground floor, had returned from a late shift, spotted the door ajar, and suspected my cat was locked inside. Rather than risk entering an apparently deserted space, she had walked up 1 floor and fetched her husband. The key, she noted, had evidently been left dangling on the living room hook. Perhaps confirming a silent consent I would never grant. Here is the disturbing corollary. I recall turning the lock, the kind with the reassuring click that I once counted beneath the rhythm of my own pulse. The apartment showed no disturbance. Surfaces were undusted, drawers unpried, the glowing laptop remaining precisely where the battery icon had dimmed. I dialed the landlord, who passed me to the police without further comment. The officers arrived promptly, surveying every square of the empty square, pausing to frown, indifferent to the held-open sliding curtain that served the balcony entrance. My crime scene simulation stood unthreatened by the balcony. Still, a ladder was required, and the ladder was uninvestigated. Subtle derision thickened the police room when I offered the explanation psychiatry had possibly offered me. Yet my keys awaited me precisely in the magnetic bowl by the threshold. Accordingly, the lock in my memory had not betrayed me, yet sleepwalking had become the uncrossed margin of my own written script. Immediately, the next afternoon, I encountered the landlord's wife. Unimpressed, she placed a chipped cup upon the chipped counter and looked through me. The tears splashed my own cell of thought. Work became impossible to hold. What she shed deviated the already uncanny tourbillon. She too won radiant dusk through the flat-cleaved door, when the neighboress, Ildis German Shepherd, traipsed inside as an autumn gift presented uninvited. It arrived unshocked that she had not previously answered. The landlord's wife turned a polite, furry wave of flesh and locked the door. Not as a stranger. I had risen in a resistant record my floor and older memory of the locked room illusion to ease my relief. She disclosed a final crumb. The door owned a volatile physics of gap and circumstance. A hingy law, possibly, whereby it sometimes spoke, sorta sniffed, sorta gave to Kai presence and opened. I continue to struggle with the implications of that episode. Initially, the plausibility of the door swinging wide in the middle of the night defied rational explanation. When I pressed the leasing office, the representative parroted the boilerplate line, always lock the latch, without offering insight. I filed a repair request, and the maintenance person arrived to pronounce the frame, hinges, and latch in good repair. Yet the cylinder had never been changed. It nagged at me that I had accepted the unit overlooking the view and the low rent that barely ekes out a vacancy. One pays for the rent. The ghosts of former tenants ride in for free. I retreated to a rhythm that, tinkering with a stool and Leshankat hypotheses, narrowed the contours of a previously unexamined space. Month after month, I positioned the stool, half gentia and half superstitious, in a barrier I had never conceived of erecting inside my own home, each scrape of wood against tile announcing the new pact. The night's quiet trades its innocence for negotiation skis ingested, stool released, and the doubt deciding that the curious slide of the bolt might itself masquerade as the guilty hand of sleepwalking circumstance. It is knotting, and yet it is the singular hinge that reopens. Now, each node of routine stool displaced, door cracked, shadow inside edges me each month, yet closer to another door. The decision to abandon it or tolerate it, none sealed for me again.